Hello, everybody. And for this special episode of the Stories of Service podcast, I have a very dear friend of mine who has been instrumental in pushing activism and change within Congress on the issue of active duty and suicide rates. And so I have to the stage today a very special guest, Chris McGhee. Welcome to the Stories of Service podcast.
Thank you very much, Teresa. It's nice to meet you in person. Everybody's always surprised I'm an absolute giant when they meet me in person. So surprise.
Well, that's what's so funny, guys. I'm here at the Military Influencer Conference. And the thing that's so interesting is that you see people on the camera and you see their face, you see what they look like in a picture. But the one thing that you can never account for is height. And so either people are taller than what you think, or they're shorter than what you think, just because in your mind, you'd really have nothing to go off of. So that's what's been so interesting about being here at the conference. I'm sure you've seen, I think I saw in your posting that you've seen a lot of your guests as well.
Yeah, I saw.
You may want to be a little closer to the mic.
I saw Sean Welsh, and I'm used to being the tallest guy, and I think he's like 6'7", 6'8".
Oh yeah, Sean,
so
that S.O.S podcast.
Yeah, he's huge.
He's actually very.
So
very
the same
tall.
thing. I was on his podcast recently talking about the Falcon Forward Law Group and like my entrepreneurship, and he didn't seem like he'd be 6'8". I imagine I probably don't look like I'm 6'4". And then we meet in person and we realize we're just two giants walking around the conference. So
I mean, that was, I think, the first thing I said to you, Chris, when I saw you. I go, "Oh my God, you're really tall." Not, "Hey, how are you doing? Oh, it's so great to meet you." It's just like the first thing that comes to mind. But today we're going to talk about something that's incredibly important and incredibly timely. One of the things that we kept hearing over and over again throughout the podcast, I mean, not the podcast, throughout the Military Influencer Conference today was the issue with veteran suicide rates. And I mean, outside very active suicide among military veterans. But one of the things that often isn't talked about is the suicide rate among active duty. And one of the ways to get at that is to look at it from a way that Chris has chosen to look at it. And we're going to talk a little bit about his saga getting to this point and then where we're going to go next. But first off, I'm going to read you just a little bit about his experiences. As I said, he's previously an aircraft maintainer. And while he was a maintainer in the Air Force, he saw an acute mental health crisis. And that inspired him to push the United States Department of Defense to study suicide rates by job code, to which, as I said in my post, there was a nice try and there was a good effort, or maybe a decent effort at doing that. But there was so much more work that needs to be done. And that's today what we're going to talk about, because the study was not only, I think, 7 or 8 months late, it was also contained partial information. So today we're talking about where this stands today, what you can do about helping with this cause. Chris McGhee is an Air Force veteran, founder of the Falcon Forward Law Group, and host of the 20 Years Done podcast, where he raises awareness of the organizational and cultural issues in the military. He played a pivotal role in crafting legislation mandating military suicide data after repeated FOIA request denials by the DoD. He also led a Department of the Air Force working group tasked with developing a post-vention model to identify organizational factors influencing suicide. His advocacy recently led to Senator Agnes King pressing the Secretary of Defense for accountability. Welcome again.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about, just kind of wrap it up as you can, because I know we've discussed it on the last show, but what was the genesis for you even starting this project, and how did you get to where you are today?
So to try to do it as succinct as possible, essentially, I retired from the Air Force in 2018, and I saw some policy decisions coming down the pike that had me concerned that it was going to overstress people that I believe were already at their absolute maximum. And so I wrote an article titled "The Crisis in Aircraft Maintenance," where I essentially predicted there would be an uptick in maintainer suicides because of a policy decision of, at the time, Secretary of Defense Mattis. And I started hearing about,
what was that policy decision?
It was called MC80 is what it was called. Essentially, in October of 2018, the Secretary of Defense says he wanted 4 fighter airframes to reach an 80% readiness rate. And that was a really big lift. And his justification was because we needed to get ready for a near-peer conflict, which is the absolute right thing to do. But the problem was he gave a 1-year deadline for it. And as someone that had been in maintenance, we weren't able to get close to that rate for the last decade. So to all of a sudden ask for people that were absolutely overworked to try to do a massive lift, I was worried that there was going to be leaders within those organizations that would see it as an opportunity for career advancement and getting closer to these metrics that the Secretary of Defense called for at the expense of the mental health of those that were working for them. So I was essentially saying, if you're a leader and you're reading this blog post, you do not need to destroy your people to reach an impossible metric. Which, by the way, I'd like to say we didn't reach that metric. It didn't happen, right? But that doesn't matter because we tried really hard to. And I started hearing of suicides at my last unit in January 2019. There was a suicide at my last unit for somebody that used to work for me. A week later, somebody else committed suicide in that same unit. And a week after that, a sister unit had a suicide. So I began to worry that that was essentially the first data point for what I predicted would happen. In July of 2019, I submitted a FOIA request to the Air Force asking for suicide numbers by military occupation code in the Air Force AFSC. And in August of 2019, the Air Force publicly announced that they are on pace to have more suicides that year than they had ever had in the history of the service since they've been tracking suicides. So I predicted it would uptick, and then I asked for the data, and then after that, they publicly announced. So January of 2020, they came back and said, we don't have suicide numbers by military occupation. And essentially, I went back and forth between DOD and the Air Force for the FOIA fight, and essentially it culminated in me preparing to sue the Department of Defense to compel release. When I was fortunate enough to have an interview with Senator Angus King for a Library of Congress project, and I had lots of FOIA data on operational tempo, fleet health, manpower that I'd been doing throughout my time in law school. And I kind of was able to speak intelligently on what was going on within the aircraft maintenance fleet, at least in the Air Force. So when that when that episode ended, the interview ended, I asked for help getting those suicide numbers by military occupation. And he said, well, I can try to help get them for you. I was like, well, you're on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I was going to give them to you.
Right.
Like I was trying to get it for you. And so I worked with the staff and we drafted legislation that was signed by President Biden December 2022 for the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. Essentially, it required a DOD to commission a report that disaggregates suicides by year, by military occupation code, and then in parentheses in the legislation, it says Air Force Specialty Code, Army MOS, Marine MOS, Navy rate, Coast Guard rate. Essentially, it said military occupation code and then broke down how that is defined in the parenthetical for the legislation, and then also disaggregated by rank. And so I was really looking forward to this report because I thought it was going to finally be able to shine a light on what I knew was going on within at least my career field and others.
We track deaths. I mean, we know who dies in the military from suicide. All we would need to do is then say, okay, these are the people who died. These were what their jobs were. Correct. We thought that, that's in theory, that's what the data needs to say.
That's correct. And that's a day and a half of an O4 with an Excel spreadsheet, moving it into a Word doc.
Right.
That's the labor that would probably be required because it's already there.
It's already there. They already track suicides.
It's just cutting and pasting
and putting what those jobs were.
Correct. So December 31st, 2023, when the report was due, the report was nowhere to be found. On January 3rd, I called Senator King's office and I called Jared Golden's office, who's the congressional rep in Maine, who's also on the House Armed Services Committee. Say, hey, where's this report? And I pretty much got the runaround for the next 2-3 months. Nobody really knew, and they were trying to get updates, which for me is already disconcerting because I was in the military for 20 years. The suspenses that I had to deal with for things that were inconsequential.
Yes.
The pain that I would suffer, the weekends I would have to come in, the leaves being canceled for a performance report that had a misspelling that nobody caught that we had to all like reaccomplish and sign off on. That was commonplace.
And even if they had not, because I know it was from GWAT forward, even if it had just been maybe the last 5 years, like something would have been better than nothing.
Correct. I mean, initially I was just chasing the last 10 years when I did my initial FOIA request because I was trying to capture the pre-sequestration and post-sequestration.
I see.
Like to capture that piece.
Right.
But when we drafted legislation, we went all the way back to GWAT, which I think is still smart because what I saw in the Air Force, the Army might have had a much worse 2001 to 2010. Actually, I suspect they probably did. Right.
Right.
So like going all the way back to 2001 was an important part because you're not just viewing it through the lens of what did the Air Force go through. You're looking at entire DOD and trying to see, because the ultimate crux of the argument is suicide is the most lagging of lagging indicators. It is the final metric to read because the idea is if we have a really high suicides in certain career fields at certain times, you basically reverse engineer what was going on in that career field and you back it up.
Right.
What happened? What was the manpower like? What was the op tempo like? What was the experience? How was the resources the year before, the 2 years before, the 5 years before? You start to look at those things. You can start to see trends and patterns. You can see maybe decisions that were implemented in 2012 caused a spike in 2014 as you see it start to play out. Maybe you see the fleet health numbers are dwindling down after 2012. You see the ops tempo rising after 2012. You see the manpower come down. You go, oh, well, clearly this is what happened here.
So the one thing that is interesting about your study, though, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation because we can really kind of, guys, get a little bit deeper into this issue because it's something that I've thought about a lot in terms of how much your work plays into your mental health. Because we all know that suicide is like anything, like any mental health issue, it's complicated, right? There's people who are going through divorces. There's people who have adverse childhood experiences. There are people who are being abused. There's many other things that are going on in people's lives. However, how much time do people spend at work?
Correct.
How much time is spent dealing with a bad boss or dealing with the cost of war? But and also when you think about it, the majority of people who actively serve, how much percentage wise, how much of them are actually in combat situations? Right. I would imagine that it's a very, very small percentage.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, and I think that's what's also really important about this report, because there are a lot of, I think, preconceived notions about who's going to have suicidality in the military. And I think when you do an occupational breakdown, it's going to paint a much more accurate picture than what people think. And I actually don't know the answer to the numbers because I haven't seen the numbers, right? So I don't know what is going to come out or what's going to ferret out in these numbers. But what I do know is when I hear about Navy personnel working a dry dock where they have 3 suicides on one boat in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That is as far removed from combat as you can get. But it's your body physiologically and psychologically, suffering is suffering. And your body physiologically can't differentiate between suffering in Iraq or suffering in the hull of a ship where you're getting no sleep, where you can't go to medical because they don't even have the appointments for you, where your supervisor is unempathetic and callous and indifferent towards anything that's going on with you, where you have to sleep in your car because you can't sleep on the ship because there's noise 24 hours a day, so you're sleep deprived and all these things. Your body is going to react the same way.
And what it's going to do too is it's going to prey on the most vulnerable people anyway. So the one thing that I do know about mental health problems is that it's definitely going to, these are people that may have already had problems coming in or may already be in a stressful situation or in a stressed out state. And then they get into a job that's already super stressful. And then it's just going to exacerbate the issues that they already have. So I do believe that while there might not always be this direct correlation or causation correlation equals causation, I do believe that this study is so important because it's really going to drill down into what are the most stressful jobs in the service and why, and what is causing these jobs to be so stressful. So let's back up to where your story now takes place, which is December of last year. It's 2 to 3 months later. You've checked with the senator's office. They're trying to figure out what's going on with the study. What happens next?
So in March, I received through my podcast Facebook page a message from somebody who used to work for me saying a friend of his had committed suicide in South Korea, an aircraft maintainer. And so now we're 3 months late on this report, and nobody seems in a hurry to figure it out.
Right.
So I called every single House and Senate Armed Services Committee member.
Yes, you did.
After I drafted an open letter, essentially saying that their inaction made them complicit in this suicide and any future suicides until they compelled DOD to release the study. I got, I think, one single response from one congressman, and the response was a form letter describing his efforts, legislative efforts in the veteran space. So it did
How
not.
many did you call total? Do you remember?
I don't know. It's a 3.5 hour podcast. But I think it's somewhere like 70 to 80. I didn't know how many it was when I started, to be honest. I had no idea.
And if you guys care to listen, it's worth your time because I did. I listened to, actually, I don't know if I listened to the full 3 hours, but I listened to a good portion of it. And it's really fascinating, some of the dynamics that play out in these calls. The fact that you really are not talking to anyone that knows anything, which tells me that they just staff these offices with college kids that seem nice, but are not knowledgeable on any of the issues. They're there just to basically be traffic cops.
Yeah.
That's what I felt as I was listening.
And I've kind of felt that through the process, through this entire process, and I'll kind of get into more of that in a little bit, where it feels like I'm just being placated. Like, what do I need to say to get Chris off the phone? Right. What do I need to say to make this go away?
But and none of them knew even about the issue. And while I understand that to a certain degree, because they've got so many issues that come through on their plate, this is such a serious and just I mean, but maybe it was astounding to me also how many of them said the same information. Oh, you need to talk to our PR person or whoever. And then you would ask like, oh, how do I get in touch with this person? Oh no, I can't give you the number. I can't have that person call you.
Yeah. Or they were like, they would like, you can't, don't tell me anymore. You need to send an email. I'm like, no, the email was not readily available. I've already done the legwork here, and I'm actually just calling you to give you a heads up on this open letter, and you can deal with it in due time. But thankfully, through that episode and that open letter, I reached out to Davis Winke at the Army Times. He had just done an article on Army tank maintenance crews having high suicidality. When I read that article, it very much mirrored what my experience was in aircraft maintenance, telling me it's really like almost a maintainer culture problem across services. But he was nice enough to go over to Congress and go, hey, I'm hearing there's supposed to be some report. Is it out? And then it wasn't. And now all of a sudden, I had in that article that Davis Winke wrote about the report being late, I had quotes from 3 congressmen. Hey, we know it's late. It's important. We're going to get on it. Then all of a sudden it felt like the wheels were finally in motion.
And do you really believe that that's what it took, that Army Times article, to kind of push and prod the DOD to start to work on it? Or
well, they didn't push and prod the DOD. It pushed and prod the congressmen to push and prod the DOD. That's correct.
Okay. Interesting.
And what was interesting is that Army Times article also referenced a letter from the Undersecretary of Defense Vazirani saying that he sent in January 12th of 2024, saying the report's going to be late because they needed more time for better statistical analysis. And when I read that, it made me a little bit concerned because the legislation didn't call for an analysis by DOD. It simply called for the numbers. Disaggregated numbers, and that was it.
But they wanted to explain why. Like, how do they even know why? I mean, if they've and really that type of analysis that could take years to try to get into why for each. Just put the numbers out.
Well, they weren't even getting into the why. So the statistical analysis was, I've been doing this for 5 years, and I think at this point, and I don't know if I'm like just paranoid, I genuinely think DOD is operating in bad faith in this space, in this transparency space in particular. They denied a FOIA, said the records didn't exist, said, oh yeah, they do, sorry. They said, we're not going to release the records because it's a privacy violation for you to know a occupational code and a suicide number next to it for a year. That's ridiculous. And they've essentially just been stonewalling through and through. And I would add one more item in support of my belief that this is essentially the report, I believe, was drafted in bad faith. The report, it came out on July 30th.
Let's talk about now the report, because it did come out.
So the report came out on July 30th. This is not Chris McGhee's interpretation. I'm actually like essentially paraphrasing what the report said. They said, we are not going to disaggregate by year. They said, we are not going to disaggregate by the granular service-specific military occupation codes. Instead, we're going to use a DOD level occupation code. So I'm going to lump infantry into one pile in the Army, which might be combat engineers, might be special forces, might be infantry, right? I'm going to lump aircraft maintainers in the Air Force into one. That might be non-destructive inspection. It might be sheet metal, might be crew chiefs, might be avionics, might be helicopters, might be heavies, might be fighters. Those are all very different cultures organizationally and otherwise.
And resourced and funded differently as well.
Ops tempo, everything is different, right? And so they came out and said, oh, and by the way, we're not going to go back to 2001 because the report essentially said, in order for us to give you a suicide rate, we have to have more than 20 suicides in order to craft a rate per a DOD instruction. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but a DOD instruction does not take priority over explicit federal legislation that directs how the report will be constructed. Right. So when the report says you will disaggregate by year from 2001 until present, you will disaggregate by military occupation code, that did not give DOD the leeway or the latitude to interpret that into what they wanted to do. And that wasn't what I discovered reading through it. That was in the first 5 pages of the report. Said, we're not going to disaggregate by year because that can introduce signal noise and statistics and it might be misconstrued. So when the DoD did this report, it was mainly analysis that just mushed information together. And if that's what DoD wanted to do, that's fine. They're perfectly allowed to do that. But that didn't exempt them from still including the disaggregated raw data the law called for.
And the law called for disaggregated
Absolutely.
raw data.
Absolutely, it did. So, and that report was signed by the Undersecretary of Defense, Vazirani, the same Undersecretary of Defense that sent that letter to the House and Senate Armed Services Committee in January saying the report's going to be a little bit late for better statistical analysis. What a lot of people don't know is that the Undersecretary of Defense, Vazirani, testified at the House Armed Services Committee on 13 December 2023 that negative public perception of the military online and social media was hurting recruitment and retention. So the same person that signed off on a report with mushed up suicide data is the same person that testified to Congress that negative public perception was hurting recruitment and retention. In this case, the fox is in the hen house. He is completely conflicted out. You can't have somebody say negative public perception is hurting recruitment and retention to then be tasked with releasing a report of suicide data that is now in violation of the law.
You're absolutely correct. Wow. And what it also does is because it's not aggregated by a particular job code, you can't make any conclusions about the data.
That's the point.
Like they basically made it so that they put out something because they thought that it would appease, but all they did was really show their cards that they weren't, like you said, acting in good faith. And that's a shame. And what happened when some of these other big organizations who play nice and want to play political and not want to rock the boat too much, well, but still could see that this isn't what was asked for and what wasn't in the NDA. What was it like trying to work with some of those groups? Like I remember when I read the news articles, there were some of these major organizations that commented on it.
So the big one was, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. It was a think tank out of DC with a brilliant woman. I think her first name's Catherine. Her last name escapes me. I'll post a comment on this on this feed when we're done. But she essentially said, this data is not good. It's not disaggregated. It needed to be more. She backed up it needed to be more granular. And I had a great conversation with her on the phone. And me and her both agreed that the data was worthless. Absolutely. And so that was essentially the consensus. It's not workable. And I think that leads to the narrative that has been pushed by DoD for 10 to 15 years, which is the suicide problem is unsolvable. And I think the data being all mushed up, I think that's intentionally crafted for it to show that it's not solvable or it's a predetermined outcome. Infantry, they have a high rate, right? And so I think the problem is I know some of the data because I've gotten some of the data, and so when you do two things, when you're required to have the data disaggregated by occupation code and year, you're going to be able to see very specifically what was happening in a particular moment in time in a particular community. And so what I believe one of the bigger catalysts were for suicides, at least in the Air Force, was that in 2014, sequestration cut the Air Force to the smallest active duty force in the history of the United States Air Force. We went to the smallest number ever. And I FOIA'd flying hours for Air Force aircraft from 2013 to 2019. And even though we cut 10 to 15% of our aircraft maintainers, especially legacy fighter aircraft maintainers, F-16, F-15, A-10, our operational tempo, our flying hours stayed exactly the same. So we maintained the exact same operational tempo. We cut 10 to 15% of our personnel, but you can't see that. You can't see that impact when you lump 2011 through 2020, because by the way, the Air Force suicide rate prior to 2014 was between 10 and 15 per 100,000. In 2014 to 2021, it jumped between 20 to 25. So we cut our personnel to the lowest ever, maintained the exact same operational tempo, and we saw a 25% increase in our suicide rate, Air Force wide, sustained for 8 years. So by taking 2011 and 2022 and mushing all those years together, you take the low end from prior to sequestration, the high end, and you mush it together. And once again, it looks like it's high, but you don't understand that there's a 25% rise that sustains for 8 years after a specific moment in time. That's what we're missing.
Wow. That's just unfortunate that they weren't able to be honest, I guess. I mean, it's a shame, and it makes me sad. Like, it really does. It makes me sad that it wasn't this push also by the legislators to say, give me the right data, give me what the NDAA said we needed, and what we need to understand. Because I will say, like, this is happening everywhere. Even in the Navy, there was a recent GAO, Government Accountability Office, or Government Accountability Report regarding the surface warfare community, for example. And if you read that report, I mean, we're sending ships out to sea right now that are not fully manned, and that are not, and people, and there are issues with this, and people are talking about this. I mean, I have a very dear friend, John McCordle. He's very, very active in the space of trying to conserve sleep and work on troops' mental health conditions. And it's very unfortunate to me that there isn't this kind of conversation that's going on about the correlation between retention and recruiting, especially retention in this case, and the amount of resources and people that were devoting to the job. I mean, even in my own public affairs community, we have people getting out in droves at my pay grade. There's a reason for that. And it's like, people just don't want, I mean, I look at the jobs that I would have had to take if I had stayed on that career path, and I don't want to be completely stressed out every single day and having to see a therapist, which is what many of my colleagues are having to do, because they don't feel like they can accomplish everything that's being asked out of them. And
I love John Cordle to death. I've had him on my podcast, I think, twice, and I correspond with him on LinkedIn all the time. And he's right. Like, when we under-resource the mission, and when I say under-resource, it's a broad definition. We're talking about old parts, old ships, old jets.
You're right.
You're talking about not enough people. Even the people you have may not be experienced, maybe on the particulars of the job.
Right.
They may not be experienced on deployment. When they're just stretched really thin, that's when you see the USS Fitzgerald, USS John McCain. You see these mishaps when we're talking about overworked people, skeleton crews. You're talking about all these sorts of things. But what John misses, at least from what I tell, is it's not just about the mishap risk associated with basically sending out these starved crews, right? Because it's also like, even if they come back without a mishap, the harm has already been done. They've been overworked, stressed. We don't know what happened from port to port in order to get there. We don't know what they sacrificed, or what, more importantly, the DoD extracted from them in order to get it there safely. Right. So even when it's under-resourced and there's no mishap, doesn't mean we're not incurring a cost. Right. And that cost is in recruitment, retention. Because it's retention, but I bet all those PAOs that are getting out, they're not getting out telling their friends, you should join the Navy and be a PAO.
And I think what some of the problems with some of these issues is the fact that then the cost is just being transferred onto the VA, because then now those people are going to get 100% disability. And they're also, I mean, this just isn't the right way to take care of people.
It's not.
I mean, I think that's just like the bottom line, is that we want people who are energized and want to be at the job and want to feel that they can do the job. It reminds me so much of the cause with the Inspector General system, and having a fair system and a way to adjudicate cases. If people don't feel safe serving, if they don't feel like, if they take the responsibility of becoming the CO and will be able to withstand or survive a complaint, and think that there'll be a fair process, or if on the other end, if a person is harmed or feels as though they have been victimized, if they don't feel like there's a fair process for that issue to be investigated, then they aren't going to want to serve in a system
correct
where they're not going to have what they need. And I think that's what this really comes down to. And that's where I think it's so distressing that they just didn't provide the numbers. Just provide the numbers and let the system take care of itself. Because when we see the numbers, then there's going to be no choice but to adequately resource and man the fleet that we need. And yes, it is going to involve, I mean, that's, I think, where this really goes to is, okay, so now we are going to put more money on people and resources. Where's the money going to come from?
Correct. And so that's a good point. And I'm not sure if many of the people I've talked with realize this, like, this is really very likely a congressional problem. And I'm just trying to drag all the service chiefs into Congress for them to explain why their suicide rates are so high. Because, by the way, as I think I said in the previous podcast, in 2013, the 5 Joint Chiefs sent a letter to Congress saying, if you enact sequestration, we will probably be able to meet our commitments downrange and our contingency requirements, but in garrison, we will not be able to maintain proficiencies, and we will have to reduce our personnel, and you are going to create a hollow force that will have long-term effects to national security over the next decades. Turns out the 5 smartest people in the military, when they come together and send a letter to Congress warning what's going to happen, they probably know what they're talking about. So again, and it's a very tough pill to swallow when we have a Pentagon DoD budget of what, like 870 billion or whatever it's been recently. For people that may not be familiar with the military to hear, it needs a lot more.
Right.
And it either needs a lot more, or we need to rein in our operations from the executive to actually operate within the resource restrictions that the Congress is budgeting the DoD for. Because right now, those are in a very disparate state, and the glue connecting those two are the human beings that are spiking in suicides.
Well, and I think that's the honest conversation that so many people are afraid to have. I mean, when we get really, really strategic and start to really think this through, it's like, how much longer can the United States sustain being the lead in so many of these things? Like we hear a lot about, and I don't want to go into a very political conversation about, the NATO and the 2% and all those other things, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, that can't even begin to be had if we're just draining out and like you said, hollowing out the force, where retention and recruiting is so abysmal, because people just don't feel that they're going to be safe if something happens, if they get in trouble. Like, I don't trust the investigative process at all. And I think that that's something that, if they don't look to that first, they're never going to get to a place where they're really going to have the force that they need. They're just going to have the force that's just kind of limping along. And I applaud what you're doing. So you did get some headway on the fact that this report was not, back to the story, that was not exactly what it should have been. So tell us a little bit about that recent development.
Yeah, so a really big win, and a big thanks to Senator Angus King and his staff. They were very receptive to my concerns once I really kind of laid it out to them. On September 19th, Senator Angus King sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense, Austin, saying that he had read the report of suicide allayed by military occupation code, and he essentially said, you didn't follow the legislation as it was written, and then it outlined specifically where it fell short, and then said, by the 1st of November, I need an update on what you're going to do about it, and then I need a timeline of when you're going to redo this report. Now, that was a huge win, because it kind of kept us afloat, because I'll be honest, when I got that report and I saw it, like, I knew what was supposed to be in it. Like, I was expecting a lot of pages. And when I got that report and I kind of went through it, I was having trouble with emotional regulation.
Yeah.
And my dog was looking at me with a lot of concern, because she had never seen me like that. Right. Like, I sobbed for hours, probably. I went to bed early. You ever cried so hard you get tired? Yeah. So I went to bed early.
And because this has just been such a fight and a slog for you. And this is sort of become like, this is your cause that you've really invested in. I understand how that feels.
Well, it was that, and coupled with the powerlessness that I had got a law drafted explicitly stating what to do, and got it through Congress,
which was already practically insurmountable,
signed by the president.
Yeah.
And now here it is. Like, I will never have more power than at that moment. So, besides President Chris McGhee, like, the only way to get higher would be to be the president, right? And so, like, when I saw the report, just in complete violation, and nobody seemed to notice or care, it was hopelessness, right? And what I'll say as well is I believe that suicide is, and I'm in no way, shape, or form glorifying suicide. Everybody should understand that suicide is the last violent outcry of someone that feels that they're not being heard or seen, that they're suffering in silence, right? And so this report to me meant we could see them. We could see these people when The 2A3 career field in 2014 was 300% higher than the Air Force suicide rate. Nobody knows that. I know that, and I have the data for it. But this report was going to show that. And it was going to let those people know that survived through that difficult time, that might still be struggling with it, that you are finally seen. Because if your suffering isn't seen, it is not going to be solved. And so this report was the chance for people to finally have hope that there would be a solution. And so when I saw the mushed up report, the grief I felt for people, the fear I felt for people that were holding on for this report, that was keeping them going, hoping that there was going to be some sort of change. My terror at the idea that someone that was on the edge would see this report and commit suicide was overwhelming. So
it's almost like moral injury. I mean, we talk a lot about that on my show. It's this idea that like you were already traumatized by the circumstances and by the fact that you weren't given enough resources to do the job. And like I said, I have only felt it on a very minor level in my own field, but I've also a previous maintainer.
Yep.
So I've seen it. I've seen it in your world as well. And it really is this very frustrating feeling where you are being given so much and you want to make everyone happy and you want to serve, but you're just not given the tools or the resources to do it. And if you, like me before, I have a wonderful support network now. I have a great husband, great friends, but I didn't come into the Navy that way.
Right.
I didn't have any of that when I was a maintainer.
Yep.
I couldn't even hold down a steady relationship.
Yep.
And it was so stressful because I would come in there and it was like every single day, 12 on, 12 off, never stops. There was never ever a break in aircraft maintenance. There's never ever all the aircrafts are up. Never. Yep. And there's just one problem after another, and you never have enough people. And like you said, it's not just the people, it's the parts that you would have. And I mean, I've seen the same thing even in my own job as a communicator, where especially at my level, I felt like more as a junior officer, I might have had a little bit more latitude, but man, you get to my rank and it's crazy how much they expect one communicator to do. Yep. And it stresses people out to the point where they want to get out. Yep. And it's very unfortunate that they didn't try to have an honest assessment of what this looked like, because there really is a correlation between what you do at your job and how your job is, and then what the resulting mental health issues are. And like you said, suicide is that last resort. Before you even get to suicide, there's all these other issues that need to be addressed. And if we have to look at the most extreme cases to see what we could have prevented, then so be it. I get as mad about this as you do, actually. Probably not as passionate, but I'm very, very passionate about mental health. And it's just very unfortunate to me that they just didn't do the study the proper way the right time around.
And it's especially egregious because, I was in the military for 20 years. You're in the military. You're an officer. Yep. You give orders, right?
Right. I do.
The military only functions when lawful orders are followed. Yeah. And you're talking about a law that directs DOD to do something specific and they disregarded it. Right. Like, imagine if your boss told you explicitly what to do and you were 7 months late and it wasn't what he asked.
I would be fired.
Yeah.
I would lose that job. And I think that's the part that they're just really, really, it's like this whole congressional bureaucracy. I mean, we learned about it. We were watching in the military influencer conference, and John Stewart was talking about what he had to go through for this burn pit legislation. It took them 20 years to pass it. They camped out on the steps of the Capitol. I mean, all these crazy things that they had to do to get that legislation passed. And I just think to myself, I mean, the same thing happened with Carol Baskin in the Big Cat Public Safety Act. Yep. I had her on my show, and it took them 20 years so people wouldn't own pet tigers anymore. Yep. I mean, it's crazy to me that the type of gridlock and the inefficiencies that I see, and it really, really just makes me want to do as much as I can to spread this awareness and to get this out there. So, but the good on their office for now mandating this. And so at this point, you're just going to be tracking this very, very closely.
So good on their office, but they fell just short because when they sent the letter to the Secretary of Defense, they said they need to disaggregate by year, but they didn't say they need to disaggregate by the granular service-specific occupational codes.
So it's still not going to be, they're just going to do year.
Correct.
And they're not going to break it down by job codes.
Probably.
I mean, if it's not asked for, they're not going to do it.
Right. So I reached out to Congressman Golden's office because he's on the House Armed Services Committee. And I said, hey, here's a really good chance for you to get a really easy slam dunk. Senator King's already sent a letter, so you're not stepping on anybody's toes.
You just need to make it a little more granular.
You do the same letter and you just do occupational stuff, right? And I'm still waiting to hear back. I talked to a staffer last Friday. I stopped off in DC on my way down here to the conference. And the staffer assured me he would bring it to Congressman Golden's attention. So I'm really hoping that either this week or next week, I get a call saying, yeah, Chris, we do want to do that. We need your help or something, because it's going to...
because it's going to muddy the data. If it's not by job code,
correct,
it will muddy the data.
Correct. And what's really frustrating about this is the way the law was written is it's a report from DOD to Congress, which means as a private citizen, I don't have standing to sue saying DOD didn't do what they're supposed to do because I was not a party to the report. Essentially, I'm wholly reliant on the political process of Congress to go back to the DOD and say, hey, we wrote these words and you didn't follow these words and you didn't follow it here, but you also didn't follow it here as well. And so that's why really when I came to the Military Influencer Conference, my mission has been to try to get public awareness because Congress doesn't move without public awareness or, as I've learned, the threat of public awareness. And so it's very hard for a civilian population to understand the importance of the occupational data and the disaggregation. But in this case, we're at the Military Influencer Conference. Everyone here it precisely understands why this granularity is so critical to the report. So I've been doing my best to try to talk to people that have a network. Like I was genuinely socially exhausted from yesterday. That I was supposed to do I was supposed to be here at like 10 o'clock today, and I just stayed home and in the dark till like 2.
Yeah.
My partner's like, I thought you were going. I was like, I am just wore out.
It's hard, and especially when you've got this cause that's just so vital and so important to you, and it's hard to your cause is hard to explain to people.
Yeah,
it is. But you're right. With a military audience, we do understand that there are certain jobs that definitely extract more out of people than other jobs, and there are jobs that are adequately manned and there are jobs that are not adequately manned. And like you said, there's a mental health long-term cost, not only to the job and the mission and the effectiveness of the mission, but there's a long-term cost to the individual person who
Correct.
has to endure that stress. I mean, I had somebody, I won't say who, that tells me that she still has PTSD about going back into her office and being expected to do certain things. And I can relate to that because I've had those same feelings when I was in those certain type of jobs.
I've been out of the military for 6 years now. I still have dreams about work.
Yeah, because it's a very, very frustrating feeling when you're being given too much to do and not enough people, resources, equipment to do the job, and to not be transparent about that as a military organization. It's very distressing, and I just applaud what it is you're doing, and I do hope that this show and other shows that you go on will bring awareness to this. I really would love for you to get somebody like a Jon Stewart or somebody like him. Really
you know what I did, and this resulted in tears too. I don't know if you saw, but like a month and a half ago, Jon Stewart was auctioning off a 15-minute Zoom session.
I did see that. Yes,
I bid up to $11,000 that I did not have. I mean, I pulled money from places I don't like to pull money, but I was outbid by somebody with apparently higher means than I had. And my plan was I get 15 minutes. I can sell this in 15 minutes to this person. Right. And he doesn't have to take it, but he probably can lean on somebody else to take it for me. My plan was to go fund me on the back end to try to recoup whatever, because if I succeed, then it's a lot easier for me to say, hey, can you pay this back?
Sure.
Unfortunately, I was just simply outbid, and that's the way it went. And I was hoping that I think initially he was going to be in person here at the conference. So I was going to try to do that too, plead my case. Unfortunately,
and we also tried to do a panel together.
Correct.
Yeah, we tried to put in for a panel, and we understand. I mean, they have a lot of panels and they have a lot of causes. We're definitely not denigrating the MIC conference at all, but it would have been. This is such an important cause, and I have no doubts in my mind, Chris, that this is just going to continue to grow, and that we will not be having this small conversation about this issue. It's just going to keep getting bigger, and I'm going to continue to share about it, and I'm going to continue to have this conversation, and I'm going to continue to encourage others to do the same, because I've never seen someone look at this issue of suicide in this lens before, and no one else is doing it. And it needs to be had. That's another question, as we're getting towards the end of the call, do you get pushback from people who say, oh, well, suicide and job code are not related?
No.
Really?
I've not met a person.
Oh, that's fascinating. So not one person, because I'm sure you talk to all these decision makers, you talk to all these legislators, so nobody disagrees with you.
I have yet to meet a person going, Chris, that's dumb. Not a person.
Wow, that is, oh my God, that's insightful. Because I did think that maybe you would get some pushback or somebody.
And I talk a lot, and not a person.
So what do they say when they? I mean, what kind?
They go, yeah. Well, first they go, that isn't already out there. Was the most common response.
Oh, and that isn't already in a public place.
They assume it already is.
They can't believe it's not public.
Correct.
Because why shouldn't it be? I mean, what? Here's the other piece to this. Even if it was public, we would still have to pressure people to act.
But you know what?
There would be another step to this.
You know what's so important about being public is, so right now, the DoD has wholly contained suicide prevention within the DoD, and every once in a while they'll outsource and choose, right? Think about how useful this data would be if it was available publicly to academia, nonprofits that work in this space, any other thought leaders in this space. There is
considered that
a massive intellectual academic well that we are just not using at all whatsoever.
So all these different organizations, I mean, and sorry, May Lee, I'm going to get to your question in just a second, but they opened the Military Influencer Conference with a coalition of nonprofits who are studying suicide. And I remember, I don't know if you were there at the opener. That must have been kind of like, if I were you, I kind of probably would have been sitting there like, why aren't they talking about the elephant in the room? Why? I mean, because all of these veterans that are suffering from suicide, I would bet 99% of them had a job or did something in their occupation
because
that was related to maybe some of these things that they're going through now.
I would not be surprised, and this will probably be the next piece, but I really truly believe this study will essentially unlock a lot of other things happening, right? This data has to come out. But I would be very interested to see VA suicide data lagging. Like if we see a spike of suicides in 2014 under 2A3s, and then we look at VA suicide data for veterans in 2016, 2017, do we see that wave carry into post-military time?
And that would be another interesting study.
Sure.
Is to look at that and to compare.
But I got to start with the one before I can do the other.
Yeah, you do. All right, May Lee, she says, I'm sorry I joined a few minutes late, so I may have missed it. But why is publishing the info by occupational field so difficult? Annual reports have marital status. Yeah, we did cover this in the beginning of the call, but we'll definitely go over it. Have marital status, ranks, age, and sex plus other things. I can't see that's why this one factor is such a secret.
I know why it's a secret. The Air Force, the DoD doesn't control whether you're married or not. It doesn't control your sex. It doesn't control your race. It doesn't control all those things, but it does control your occupation and what you experience in your occupation. So we can look at all of these demographics and we can have them and publish them, because if those numbers ferret out something, that's not a DoD problem,
right?
But an occupational disparity between the same demographics
means
it's going to be a DoD issue. Because that's the nice thing about this. You've pretty much controlled for most of the variables, because you have the American melting pot moving through basic training and getting slotted into career fields. And yes, you're probably going to have aircraft maintenance might be 70% men, 30% women or something to that effect. But you're probably going to control for race and certainly age, right? Because we're all the same age, 18 to 45 or whatever it might be. So you've controlled for most of those variables that are essentially predetermined. But when you see, as I've said, in 2014, the suicide rate in the Air Force was 14 per 100,000 for 2A3s, fighter aircraft mechanics. It was 45 per 100,000. You're talking about a 300% difference. And you go, well, what's going on for that specific variable? And then you start to see it.
I'm just shocked that that I'm talking to you about this, and I'm not talking to some lead with some major veteran organization that is just pushing this. That's what's just so mind-boggling to me, is the fact that this is one guy who started a campaign that was born out of his own experiences, who is pushing this forward, and not these like major influential nonprofits that basically all they do is study suicide. And not one of them has said, let's go to the root issue. Let's go to the root cause. Now, I would agree that there are so many other factors. And then how do you, I do want to ask that question, because I know that in my mind, I'm very good at devil's advocate.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, in your mind, put job by job, the person's job next to, well, this person has very low resilience because of childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
This person has this traumatic experience not related to their job. How do you place that?
So first of all, I'll say I don't think suicides are solvable to a zero, because I think there's always going to be the underlying thing. So there might be the marital problems, there might be addiction, right?
Right.
But here's what I'll say. I think a lot of those issues are also lagging indicators for occupational stuff. So I'm willing to bet that when we see career fields that have high suicidality, you're probably going to see high DUIs, high alcohol-related incidents. You're probably going to see high divorce rates, because they're working all the time, or they deploy all the time, or they're bringing home that anger ball from work and they're dumping it into their spouse type of deal. So there are going to be these different variables, and I'm also certainly not saying that the DoD is the source of every single suicide.
They're not the ones that cause childhood trauma.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. I actually did a wonderful episode where I talked about how childhood trauma is often selected for by the DoD when getting new recruits instead of actually filtered out. Right. So
because sometimes they might go after the most vulnerable people.
No, I think so. First of all, if you have somebody that comes from an affluent sort of family, they very likely sought treatment when they're a teenager, which means now they have a mental health record, which means they're actually going to get precluded from joining the military. Where someone that came from poverty that didn't have access to healthcare is not going to have a medical record. And then they move into basic training where they're dealt with an authoritarian that screams at them for 6 to 12 weeks, or however long it is.
Treatment for that. They never understand how to deal with it.
No. Like they were probably with an abusive parent for their whole life. So they just go into, they know how to operate and exist in an abusive environment. So we don't filter them out.
Yeah.
We actually select for them, because those that didn't suffer that trauma, they show up to basic training and they freak out. They're like, what's going on? Right.
I never thought about it like that.
And then they come into the military, and then they have still all this trauma and baggage that has never been addressed. And then we expect them to have a perfectly clean room, to show up on time and have all these things. We put a lot of stress on them, and then they freak out. And they have all these issues.
Never had that kind of stress on them. Chris, I've never thought about that, because sometimes this is something that you see in the activist world. The people that are sometimes the strongest activists, and I can say this about my own self, are sometimes the people that have gone through the most childhood trauma. And I do believe that there's some correlation there, because I think it's one of those things where we're used to it. Like this isn't anything new to me. When I go into a toxic work environment, it's like I don't like it. It hurts me. But you
just put up your walls.
It's normalized. It's normalized to me. I'm like, oh, shady person. Okay, all right, that person. This is the dynamic that I'm going to have to operate in now. Whereas somebody who's never had those kind of experiences gets into these environments, and they sometimes struggle more. I've seen that, and it's because they don't know how to handle it, because they've just
we're maladapted to a maladaptive environment.
Right, but it doesn't make it right.
No, it doesn't. So again, you're going to have suicides that the military can't plan for, but you're going to have suicides that are completely unrelated. But when you have one career field 300% higher than another, and when I was in that Air Force working group, I heard from a senior leader in the Air Force saying, Chris, aircraft maintenance, security forces, and military intelligence are always the top 3 suicide career fields for the last decade. They just move around between 1, 2, and 3, whoever has the most.
What are the 3 again? Say it again.
Aircraft maintenance, security forces, military intelligence.
Interesting.
So
military intelligence is an interesting one to me, but I will tell you, I've been around intel people, and they work those people to death. Because there is a never ending need. I mean, I've even had intel officers on my show, and I tell them all the time, I just feel sorry for them, because it is a relentless pursuit of information that is nonstop. You could say the same thing about public affairs, but the difference is that our commanders are sadly sometimes not as concerned about public messaging as they are about intel. and they will just, I mean, the intel officers that I have seen are just run ragged.
Yep.
So that does not surprise me.
But what that tells me is, if it's the same career fields for the last decade, it's not we actually put a bunch of childhood trauma into these 3 career fields. Nope.
Right. No, there's something about those jobs and the expectations that are being placed on the people that are in those positions that drive them to have more mental health problems than other jobs.
When I was probably one of the final points here, but when I was a section chief in 2016, a computer-based training came down last minute, like dumped on all of us, and we all had to get it done. It was called Overwhelmed Aircraft Maintainer Suicide Awareness Training. So the Air Force developed an entire suicide prevention that was only required of aircraft maintainers and was targeted that community and specifically. So I did a FOIA request to Air Education and Training Command course development saying, I want all the documents you had in determining to make that.
Make this class.
Right. And that's where I found out that 2A3, my career field, was 300% higher than the Air Force suicide rate in 2014 because they had a graph of raw suicide numbers from 2010 to 2015 that showed these raw numbers of suicides. And then down at the bottom, it showed the population, and it showed the population going down and the suicide rate going up.
So they knew. So what you're saying is that the information's out there. It's just not being released.
It makes them look bad. And I think they're framing it as, if we release this, it's going to hurt recruitment and retention. It's going to hurt national security. We can't get this information out.
But the problem is that it really ultimately would
Correct.
make retention and recruiting better, because it would force the allocation of resources and manning and supplies and things towards these jobs, which would in turn make people want to stick around.
Correct.
That's just what's so incredibly interesting. Well, I thank you so much. We really dove deep today into this topic, a lot deeper than we did on our last conversation. I will do whatever it is that I can do to continue to support you, just like I do with Walk the Talk Foundation, just like I do with John and all the causes that he does towards surface warfare community. It's funny because surface warfare is a prior community of mine. Aviation is a prior community of mine. Of course, public affairs is my current community. And so I'm very passionate about making those jobs and all the jobs within the service places where people want to work and want to be and making those environments healthy. And this is the kind of conversations that we need to have to do that. So if people want to know more about you and they want to follow, where can they find you?
So the best thing to do would probably connect with me on LinkedIn, because that's where I usually drop all my spicy hot takes on DOD's actions. If you are a veteran and you want help with your VA disability claim, you can find me at www.fafo-law.com. And also you can find the 20 Years Done podcast. I've been on a little bit of a podcast hiatus because I didn't want to tip my hand on some of the behaviors I was doing, which, by the way, I love my listeners, because they let me take 2 months off from the podcast to do all that work behind the scenes. And then I pop right back up. My listens go right back up through the roof.
That's awesome.
And I just really appreciate the support they give me. And they give me the latitude to do the important work behind the scenes day in and day out. So, well,
you have a lot of support from me, Chris, and I will continue to push this forward and to do what I can on my end to bring awareness to this cause. I have no doubts in my mind that one day we're going to see you on the big stage in MIC. And I mean, I'm not saying that in a oh my gosh, look at you, you're so great kind of way, but in a like this is right up there with burn pits. I mean, this is that important. And I'm at the ground level of seeing where this is going to go, but this is just going to continue to rise.
Yeah, it's kind of strange because, like, I know eventually this is going to come to fruition.
It will.
It will. And so it's like I'm just grinding away, but I just have to pierce that public awareness.
And you need also some of these big league groups to start joining you.
Yeah.
I know they're going to. And here's what they're going to do. And mark my words, they do it every time. And I see it in the animal world. They're going to do it. They're going to come in like later on and then try to take all the credit. And it's going to get kind of political. So hopefully you'll do your best.
Well, luckily I have,
I mean,
also,
at that point,
also I don't care about credit.
Right.
I just need this information out, but also I have 5 years of well-documented history. So I'm not super worried about it.
I know, but I'm just letting you know that I see this happen in so many causes in the animal world where there'll be advocates like you who've worked this information on the ground for so many many years, and then the big leagues come in, but you need them.
I do.
And that's the thing. Like it's a reciprocal relationship, because those big leagues are the ones that get you like the big names or the celebrities or somebody else to take up this cause. But this cause is that big. And I have no doubt that it's just going to continue to grow. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. I do not know when I'm going to do a podcast next. I do start my new job on Monday is my official day. So it might be a couple weeks before I get shows up and running again. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all those who I saw at the Military Influencer Conference. It's been great to see all you guys in person. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and have a great night. Take care now. Bye-bye.